minute 16, if I may.
Please, thank you. First, I would like to thank the IDSA for inviting me. I think we would all agree this is the third day of the conference, and it's been an extraordinary conference, and the fruit, the pal, if you use the Hindi term, and all that it connotes, has been tremendous in terms of what we've learned through the presentations, what we've learned through the question and answers so ably chaired by the various chairmen, and also in the opportunities for us to meet and discuss as colleagues and even to become friends. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Dahya Saab, Dr. Namrata Goswami, Sohrab, Avi, his wife, everybody else who did all the logistics to make this possible. I thank you very much, and I ask that we give them a round of applause. Thank you. You anticipated the title of my talk. My title of my talk is India in the New Central Asia Strategic Landscape. And I originally titled this talk India and the New Central Asia Strategic Landscape. And I looked at the title and I said, that reflects a certain bias. The choice of whether to write and or in. And I chose to write in. So I'm going to be upfront with my bias that I believe India has a vital role to play in Central Asia. It is in India's strategic interest to play that role in Central Asia. If India does not play that role in Central Asia, it will be entirely out of the game of Eurasian politics, and India will be relegated to being an island nation. So I'll be upfront with that. It's not, there we go. So before we get into geopolitics and geostrategy, I'd like to give what I call the philosopher's caution to the geopolitical analyst. And that is the phrase, the map is not territory. David, in his very fine presentation, touched on this quite a bit. Our strategic choices are often about how we conceive of the various maps, and discussions we've had about the new connectivity, that sometimes our strategy is hindered by the fact that we have old maps, we're not responding to the new maps or the changing environment. So we should not confuse a map, which is a mental construction, with the territory. And here's the original Connect Asia policy. This, is, you might recognize, as the Mughal Empire, founded by Babur, who on his father's side was descended from Timur, and his father's side descended from Chinggis Khan. So, and in the blue, if you're not familiar with that, is the previous Ghurid Empire, which you see already connected Iran, Central Asia, and India, put in northwest India. So there is the historical connection. There is this kind of map. But there are other maps. This is the original Eurasian integration project, the largest land empire the world has ever seen, of course, the Mongol Empire. Part of it is reflected in the map that President Putin has for his Eurasian Economic Union, a different vision of what the map of Eurasia should be. If you might recall, India was not part of the Mongol Empire. And then more reflecting the Mongol Empire is the Silk Road, China's Silk Road initiative, both its land Silk Road initiative and its maritime Silk Road initiative. You are so humble, Namrata. You came after my thanks for you, but I hope you heard that I so appreciate the fruits of this conference. In fact, when I was thinking about it last night, if you'll indulge me, I composed a line of Urdu poetry. So, इस conference से हर पल तेरे याद है. So, yeah. So again, I appreciate it very much. It's a very big privilege to be here. So, as a friend of India, I'd like to not only bring the good news, but the bad news. If I'll start with the bad news and then get to the good news. The bad news I covered in my Harvard Asia quarterly article, which you mentioned. The basic points are, I'll just read them very quickly. Although India needs to counterbalance Chinese and especially Pakistani influence in the region, New Delhi has sought to maintain its strategic autonomy from both Moscow and Washington. This policy has caused Russia, in addition to China, to marginalize India in the region. Without a robust strategic partnership with any of the major powers, coupled with a delivery deficit in deepening its economic cooperation with the Central Asian republics themselves, New Delhi finds itself sidelined in the region. So it's two things that work together: the security relationship and the economic relationship. India's insistence on a policy of strategic autonomy in conjunction with its inability to increase bilateral trade has damaged India's position in Central Asia. This story should be familiar to most of you. For those of you who are not familiar with India and Central Asia, I'll go over it very briefly. The story starts with India betting the farm basically in Tajikistan. Why India chose Tajikistan, you can understand from the map. It's a border state to Afghanistan. It's the closest Central Asian republic to India. If you look, you can see where New Delhi is and where Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, is. The distance between Dushanbe and New Delhi is basically the same distance between New Delhi and Mumbai. Furthermore, the distance between Kashmir and Tajikistan is only 30 kilometers at its narrowest point across the Wakhan corridor of Afghanistan. To make a long story short, India spent 7 years and $70 million renovating the Aini Air Force Base, which was an Air Force base abandoned by the Soviet Union after the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. Quite an ambitious project that could house 3 MiG-29 squadron hangars. They renovated the runway so any type of aircraft could land there, state-of-the-art air control systems. However, in 2010, Tajikistan said only Russia can use the base. Now, it shouldn't have come as a surprise, and it reflects perhaps a little bit of a flaw in strategic thinking, because Russia's largest military contingent abroad, the 201st Motor Rifle Division, is stationed just outside of Dushanbe, very close to the Aini Air Force Base and in 2 other Tajik cities. So again, I think the map, and for other reasons, prejudiced Indian thinking. However, in response, India created its Connect Central Asia policy, which really wasn't a different policy. It was just a policy that was given a new name, Connect Central Asia, where the policy didn't have a name before. And India started its India Central Asia dialogue. The first one was held in Kyrgyzstan in June 2012. And at that dialogue, the External Affairs Minister announced the phrase Connect Central Asia and identified the need for strengthened strategic and security cooperation and long-term partnerships in energy development. Roughly around the same period, the U.S. was pushing a similar idea, the New Silk Road. Of course, it ultimately turned out to be a new Silk Road to nowhere. Here we have former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Let's work together to create a new Silk Road, a network of economic and transit connections. That means building more rail lines, highways, and energy infrastructure. Delhi exhibited a particular lack of enthusiasm for Washington to commit to Washington on this, but that was even matched more by Washington's lack of commitment to put substantial funds into the initiative. So as I said, it was a Silk Road to nowhere. Instead, India tried to make its big push in Kazakhstan to gain a foothold in the Kashagan oil fields. For those who are not aware, Kashagan is, excuse me sir, please don't take photographs of the PowerPoint presentation, thank you. Kashagan is the largest oil discovery in the last 40 years. ConocoPhillips, one of the 7 members of the consortium, was selling its 8.4% interest. OVL had worked out a deal to buy it, pending Astana's approval. Is $5 billion, and it represented a very important foothold in Kazakhstan's oil industry, a very important foothold for India in Central Asian energy. The Indian government in April announced that it received positive indications from Astana, and then in early June it held its second India Central Asia dialogue in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, the commercial center of Kazakhstan, and they even had a special session on India-Kazakhstan bilateral relations. A month later, though, Kazakhstan changed its mind. The Ministry of Oil and Gas preempted the sale to OVL. They themselves bought the stake in ConocoPhillips, and then by September they turned around and basically sold the same stake in the Kashagan oil fields to China for an equivalent $5 billion. However, the Chinese National Petroleum Company, CNPC, an abbreviation we'll use a lot in this presentation, also agreed to provide up to $3 billion to cover half the cost of the second phase development of Kashagan. And this was when President Xi Jinping made his triumphal tour through Central Asia, and it was in Kazakhstan that he announced officially the Chinese Economic Silk Road Initiative. Turkmenistan, which is the example that I'll use for new opportunities for India, we should also know about. It's the fourth largest producer of gas in the world, largest proven reserves. It's one of the leading producers. Its Galkanish field is the second largest in the world. You could see the rest of the statistics on the PowerPoint. They have a very ambitious goal by 2030 to be able to produce 250 billion cubic meters of gas. And Kazakhstan is really seeking to emulate, Turkmenistan is seeking to emulate Kazakhstan's amazing first decade of development, in which per capita income rose tenfold in 10 years. If you're not aware, Kazakhstan is listed by the World Bank as an upper middle income country, and its economies are basically on the same level as the EU members Poland and Hungary. So this is something that Turkmenistan would like to be the next Central Asian tiger. However, just like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan is become reliant on China for this development. CNPC led the consortium that developed the Galkanish field, and CNPC is going to be the sole service contractor for Phase 2 development. In May 2014, China and Turkmenistan signed the China-Turkmenistan Friendly Cooperation Agreement. And now Turkmenistan is going to provide 65 BCM, or 20% of China's gas imports. In fact, to do this, China is going to assist Turkmenistan in creating 2 more pipelines in the pipeline system that is the Central Asia-China gas pipeline. So, India has a long way to come back. What we see is the failure, if you pardon such a harsh word, of the Connect Central Asia policy. And what I'd like to do for the rest of my talk is, since we had a long discussion about the ideology, I'd like to just briefly touch on what I call Nehru 1.0 versus Nehru 2.0, or non-alignment 2.0, what I call the India's Central Asia paradox. Then I'll talk about the new strategic landscape, and for the sake of time, I'll just use Turkmenistan as an example of how India has new partnership opportunities. Now, this is a work in progress, so I'm very much welcome helpful suggestions. As you heard, I'm updating and expanding a previous article. So I don't have time to go over this in detail. I hope we can do it in questions and answers. My basic point here is what we call Nehruism, or Nehruvian foreign policy, or non-alignment 2.0, has very little to do with Jawaharlal Nehru. It is a reconstruction that gets continually reconstruction and perpetuated by India's foreign service elite and political elite. Bottom line, I have a hard time believing that Pandit Nehru would recognize what people call Nehruism today. This is what Pandit Nehru was about. I'd like to read this. Action, to be effective, must be directed to clearly conceived ends. And my example would be from 1961. We had many people talk about 1962, but December 1961, the expulsion of the Portuguese from Goa, Operation Vijay, led by Air Vice Marshal Erlich Pinto, who tragically died 2 years later in a helicopter crash. The operation was spectacular, a tri-service operation, but in justifying the use of force, which was opposed by the United Nations, Pandit Nehru gave a very important speech where he actually used the example of the Monroe Doctrine and established what he called the Broad Doctrine. Now, I don't have time to go into this entirely, but he says, I shall go further a further step and say that any interference by any other power would also be an interference with the political system of India today. It may be that we are weak and cannot prevent this interference, a point that earlier was made that a lot depends on capabilities. But here he anticipates the future, but the fact that any attempt by a foreign power to interfere in any way, that's important, with India is a thing which India cannot tolerate and which, subject to her strength, she will oppose. That is the broad doctrine I lay down. And I have more slides about this we can go over in the question and answer period. But I think that if we follow Pandit Nehru, you would have a much different policy in Central Asia. Again, I invoke this one very important line because I don't feel India had very clearly conceived ends. And that has to illustrate that with what I call the Central Asia paradox. And here I'm using a very interesting article authored by my colleague Dr. Meena Singh Roy. It's in chapter 7 of a book that was published by the IDSA. And here you see the relative levels of Indian defense cooperation. And there's a stark gap. You see 3 of the CARs have a relatively high level of cooperation. That level is only relative in terms of each of the CARs, not in terms of India's defense cooperation. In her article, very carefully and very in a beautiful chart, Dr. Roy lays out all the indicators that she uses. And then you see Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have very little defense cooperation. In fact, in some cases, almost none. Now, look at this. There's an inverse correlation of cooperation to partnering capability. I put next to it the level of autonomy from Russia, right? And in the top grouping, there's no particular order of who is more autonomous from whom among these 3 CARs, but it's important the division of 3 and 2. What we see is an inverse level, inverse correlation between defense cooperation and autonomy from Russia. And this leads to what I call the paradox. Oh no. India has engaged the most defense cooperation with the CARs least able to become a partner with India, and vice versa, that the CARs most capable of becoming a partner in India has engaged with the least defense cooperation or none. From a strategic point of view, this doesn't strike me as being very logical. So we beam Mr. Spock back up. The new factors, though, in the geostrategic landscape open tremendous opportunity for India. First of all, the fear, the annexation of Crimea and the utilization of ethnic Russians has caused tremendous fear among the Central Asian republics about Russia's intentions. Then the sanctions against Russia have caused tremendous economic harm. You could just see the statistics for Tajikistan, where Tajikistan received over half of its GDP from remittances from Russia. Because of the decline of the ruble and the declining economic situation, that dropped by 20%. But China came in. China, in the same year, promised to invest $6 billion, which is the equivalent of 2/3 of Tajikistan's GDP. The prospect for economic hegemony in Central Asia has become palpable only in this year. Before, China was seen as an important counterbalancer to Russia, but now there's also a simultaneous fear of becoming colonies, economic colonies to China, or that somehow a Russian-Chinese condominium over Central Asia will rule the Central Asian republics. And you see this with Turkmenistan. Russia has basically reduced to zero its imports of gas from Turkmenistan. So the PRC is now the sole market for Turkmenistan's natural gas. It's desperately seeking to try to diversify its export markets. And we see this with each of the 3 wealthier CARs. They are increasing their efforts to deepen and develop partnerships with powers other than Russia and China. And this represents a very important opportunity for India. The other example is, the other important factor is on the security end, the drawdown ISAF forces from Afghanistan. I'm going to skip over this slide. I'll come back to it in questions and answers. I'm happy to talk about the threat that the Central Asian republics face from jihadi militias that now are massed on the borders of Afghanistan, and I'll talk about that in detail. You can quickly read this slide. I'm going to use Turkmenistan as an example. Turkmenistan, its dependency on China has increased. Even the 35 BCM that it exports today, most of that revenue gets eaten up in repayment of the debts that to China for the pipelines that China built. So to fill in the gap, we've seen a Turkey-Turkmenistan partnership where Turkey is building a $2 billion port, which quite importantly has LNG, liquid natural gas export capabilities. Even more so, Turkey has announced that they want 5 to 6 BCM of Turkmenistani natural gas to flow through the TANAP pipeline, which will bring gas across Turkey to be resold in the European Union. And this is quite a feat, since the major stakeholder in TANAP is Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan's rival. But now Turkmenistan is so open that it is willing to work with Turkey and Azerbaijan to do this. So again, we see tremendous opportunities for India. Japan has stepped in. Japan is building a gas to liquids in partnership with Turkey, a gas to liquids plant that will, in consumer terms, produce 814 billion liters of gasoline. It's a tremendous project, 1.7 billion. However, the cost is being most of the cost is being funded by the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Similarly, the Turks and the Japanese have combined again to create a fertilizer plant that will create 3,500 tons of fertilizer per day out of the ammonium from natural gas. Okay, so, and it's not only that the Turks and Japan, it's also Japan and South Korea. Again, very significant plants, financing coming from both Japan and South Korea. So the question is, how is India using its opportunity to reverse its delivery deficit in economic relations? The answer is it really isn't. The only thing that's on the drawing board is the TAPI pipeline, which I would talk about more, happy to talk about. But as we know, 3 days ago, there was the 20th meeting of the steering committee in Islamabad, and they still haven't found a consortium leader. India hasn't stepped up as anywhere near being a great power. India's, if you have already signed on to the logic of the TAPI pipeline, now I can understand the hesitations of having your gas come through Pakistan. But if you've signed up onto this logic, then India should play a role that is greater than the three other partners. But India has contributed the same amount of money as Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now that to me strikes me as a little odd, and it's assumed the same amount of risk. This is not how a great power acts. Also, you could look at the middle box. You could see how small the Turkmen army is, and you could see that they share a 750-kilometer border with Afghanistan, on the border with 4 provinces. Turkmenistan could not withstand a sustained offensive, a large sustained offensive by a jihadi force. What we saw, the force that went into Iraq and captured Mosul could capture significant parts of Turkmenistan. Here I can review this. There already have been attacks, and when I say the Taliban, I'm not just talking about the Taliban, I'm also talking about the Central Asian jihadi militias that are under the umbrella of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. I can get into all these details for those who are interested in these topics later. Okay, thank you. So here you can see that the border service is equal to about 1/3 of the regular armed forces, and Luxembourg is partnered with the United States to fund the training of this force. If Luxembourg can do this, how come India is not involved? So the question again, how is India using the opportunity to reverse its delivery deficit in security relations? There's a lot that India can do. Again, I would invoke Pandit Nehru when we think about this. And just to wrap up, I would also invoke the motto of the Defense Research and Development Organization, Balasya Mulam Vigyanam, which means that science or rational thought or clear thinking, as Pandit Nehru would advocate, is the root of strength. Sorry for going a little over time. Thank you very much for your attention.